And welcome back to Morning Live. Now, political stability, policy certainty or uncertainty, depending on how you want to look at it, economic growth and, of course, service delivery capabilities should feature prominently as motivations for political appointments. Now, the ANC this week announced its list of premier candidates following last week's elections. So with me this morning, I have Andile Nomlala, who is president of the Black Management Forum. Zwelinzima Vavi is SAFTU president, and political analyst Ongama Mtimka joins us from our SABC studios in Port Elizabeth. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming through and having this discussion with us, where we're going to try and unpack what needs to happen.
Yes, but Zwelinzima Vavi, the General Secretary and President. You're getting me into trouble there.
Apologies for that. Well, some things, do slip. But let's start here, and I'm going to start with you, Mr. Vavi. With regard to what we've seen in the elections, let's just start at that point. The elections have come and gone, but what was your sentiment around how they actually played out and the ultimate result that we saw?
Well, they were peaceful, and it's pleasing that everybody who participated, despite pointing out to some difficulties, but accepted the results. To us, that's a sign of a maturing democracy, which is good for South Africa's future. But the elections was, in our view, a consolidation of the right-wing power, the consolidation of the conservative way of addressing the crisis that South Africa is facing. In particular, the ANC-DA bloc basically is a bloc that says the status quo is perfectly okay at the economic level. We should be tinkering around the margins of the crisis, and the crisis is going to resolve itself. And it's a bloc that says basically the instruments that have been chosen since 1995, the announcement of the first round of privatization and the introduction of a very conservative pro-big business macroeconomic framework is okay. We need not to change that because the rating agencies are telling us that we are on the right track, and therefore we must continue. But from Labour, SAFTU in particular, we believe that that framework is exactly what is reproducing unemployment, poverty, inequalities in our country, and it has to change. Otherwise, we will find ourselves trapped in this crisis that continues to grow all the time, to the point that now we have no words anymore to describe what is happening to the unemployed, to the people who are trapped in degrading and dehumanizing poverty, and to the people who are seeing two worlds in one country. One world of the small elites that are enjoying the opulence that is benefiting from the total monopoly controlled by white big businesses, and the one world of the great majority of the people who were promised that there will be a better life for all, but we are seeing the gap between the rich and the poor continuing to rise all the time, as the statistics issued yesterday indicate.
So it's going to be interesting, and we'll come to it in just a minute, looking at the sort of cabinet appointments that will be made, speaking to the sort of socio-economic trajectory that you point out. But Mr. Nomlala, let me find out from you. Do you agree with Mr. Vavi's assertion of where we're at and where we seem to be headed?
No, it's not very difficult to disagree with him. I mean, the sentiments of our economy are very clear, that we haven't had growth, we are an unequal society, but what it becomes critical for us is that I think the outcomes of the elections do show that the political realms have changed, and ANC is no longer as dominant as it used to be, and I hope that the wake-up call on the outcome of the elections would sit with them. The reality is that we have to do unorthodox economic approach that is not as normal as it used to be. We can't continue doing the same things all the time and expect different results. So for us, I think we are very hopeful that the change that comes with the election outcome is that we would see a different economic path. And if we don't see a different economic path, as BMF will pressure the government to chant a different economic path, the reality is that we want to see a business-friendly, obviously, because we have to create employment, and government unfortunately doesn't create employment. But that business-friendly this time around must be firmed out of black business in particular, because we believe that the growth annals of this country are dependent on us unlocking the opportunities that black people are yet to realize. And those opportunities really have to be firmed up in the black business realms. We believe that the growth path of our country is dependent on many black people, as in creating their own businesses, from startup to be backed up by government through their policies, to make sure that we have an environment that includes as many of the black businesses as possible. And Mr. Vavi's problems would then be solved, because black businesses, medium-sized and even big businesses, will start creating jobs, will start creating new value into the economy. For the many years, we have had the structured economy that you find, where we have the big concentrated companies in different industries, insurance, banking, law firms, and everything else. So once we start now deconcentrating those businesses, but through creating smaller, medium-sized black businesses that could double the value, that could add more opportunities, that could create more jobs, that could end poverty. That's what government needs to focus on. So we will fervently pressure President Cyril Ramaphosa's New Dawn. We will fervently
How are you going to pressure them?
Look, it's very easy. For us now as black professionals, we are firm on the idea of being part of the solutions rather than being armchair critics. We have seen the last 10 years of us being in silent, what it could have led us. So now for us, we are very clear that in many instances we will approach the presidency directly and send our own proposals as black professionals, our own papers of what we think must be done, and failure which we would obviously take steps, for instance, of questioning or challenging some of the legislative framework that is not unlocking business opportunities for blacks. We're talking triple PFA laws. We're talking many other BEE laws that are yielding unintended consequences. So we're very clear.
And there seems to be a bit of a consensus position here in the studio, Ongama, Mtimka, in our Port Elizabeth studio. What's your take on this, listening to what SAFTU and BMF are saying with regard to it cannot continue, at least our economic trajectory cannot follow the status quo, and that something needs to change. If the president is appointing a cabinet, what should that cabinet look like in order for it to address some of the issues that they have raised?
So I think let me answer that question indirectly, Sakina, because I also want to chip in the discussion that was going on there in the studio. My impatience with us as South Africans is that we are stuck in the 1990s in terms of our discussion about policy. As far as I'm concerned, all questions about the orientation of the state and its role in the economy were settled in Polokwane, such that in the post-Polokwane moment, what you've seen over and over is a policy framework from a government point of view that affirms both the role of the state and that of the private sector. And if you look at the political parties in South Africa, notwithstanding some of the criticism of the left, the political parties, the ANC, the DA, and the EFF, have got a policy outlook which encourages both strong intervention by the state and the participation of the private sector. And they've gone on to point, for example, what are those things that are needed in the economy, such as special economic zones, as well as strategic interventions in particular sectors of the economy to grow. Where the challenge is, Sakina, it's a leadership problem. In South Africa, we are very comfortable debating policy. When it comes to actually leading to implement policy and ensure that, for example, monies which the state avails for black business to thrive, that's where the challenge is. Because you will find, for example, every time that a funding instrument is created, either for the IDC, for CIFA, for the NEF, the challenge becomes reorientating those institutions that manage that funding to have a greater risk appetite to stimulate entrepreneurship in the country. Because currently they operate on developed world standards, when in fact countries that have actually developed stimulated entrepreneurship by relaxing some of the requirements, for example, for accessing government funding. So for me, we don't have any more room from a policy point of view in order to actually stimulate what we need to do. We know what needs to be done. We have consensus about it. We just need the courage to build a capable state and have a private sector that is compassionate and actually thinks about the challenges in the country and wants to play a role there in the same way that Asian businesses do when it comes to executing state-driven policy.
So, Mr. Vavi, how precarious is the president's position then in appointing this cabinet that, as Ongama Mtimka says, has to then make sure that we follow through on these policy positions that we have adopted?
Can I just have a few comments on what he says? Because,
go for it.
I don't agree with the propositions. When he says that the policy debates were settled in Polokwane, as everybody knows, I was one of the biggest proponents of that 14-point plan that came out of Polokwane as the resolutions of the ANC in terms of what must be done to address the economic challenges we're facing in our country. In my view, had that 14-point plan been implemented, I will probably still be in COSATU, and COSATU will still be the fastest growing federation in the world, and that at least steps would have been taken to realign macroeconomic policies with the rest of the economic interventions that must be made to address the deindustrialization of South Africa and to close the gap between the rich and the poor in the country. The alliance and certainly COSATU would not imploded as a result of many of us beginning to say the road that we are traveling is moving us further and further away from the RTP, the Freedom Charter, and the 14-point program agreed to in that Polokwane conference. So
but it
I want to
seemed as
contest
though
that, but that's now
14-point plan, though, it didn't convince business because business did not invest in the South African economy. So how are you going to realize those ideals without the buy-in from business?
Because I think, unfortunately, for 25 years, we have had the most lack of leadership, spineless leadership, people with no backbone, people who could not lead society into a different direction away from the crisis that we are speaking about.
So what
people
would
who, even when they have had clear policy directives from their own conferences, such as in the case of Polokwane, but still wanted to double speak. In the morning, they speak to Labour and they're saying things are going to change. When they speak to the IMF and the rating agency and the big business chambers at night in Sandton, they tell them that nothing is going to change. The macroeconomic framework that we inherited from 1996 intervention will remain as it is, which is how I lost hope on President Zuma, by the way. He tells us something else in the morning. He goes to London and tells the Queen something opposite to what he has told us in the morning. And I think that Ongama must accept that there have been such policy zigzag. But the people who have been benefiting from these policy zigzags are the status quo guys, are the owners of capital today, are the owners of land and property today. And the people who were promised freedom are the face of this unemployment, squalor, and inequalities. So your question, what will the president do? Frankly, from our point of view, based on what we have heard so far, nothing is going to change. There will be rhetoric, and one point that Ongama is making, fundamental mistake, is talk about a compassionate capital in South Africa. It doesn't exist, not in our country, not in a country where the top CEOs are earning 17 to 23 million annually, but are asking workers to earn a 3,500 rands or 20 rands an hour. There's no compassion in capital. The profit objectives remain the primary objective of what they are doing on a daily basis, completely ignoring the crisis at hand at the economic level. So we need, hopefully, a president that will say, for goodness sake, the macroeconomic policies that we have been pursuing for at least almost 25 years now are reproducing poverty, unemployment, and inequalities. We need to change tack, and our appeal to the president as SAFTU is, can't you see the piling up evidence that this path is taking us into an implosion of this society? Can't you convince your cabinet that there needs to be a total review? We need to go back to the drawing board and admit that the economic policies have not worked to the benefit of the greater majority of our people.
But Andile, the other reality here is, of course, that there are competing interests from an economic perspective here. In as much as you have Zwelinzima, Vavi, and those who are more left-leaning, saying and advocating for what he wants, you also have then the capitalists and, the monopoly elements who would be advocating for something perhaps slightly different. And then you have, of course, the ratings agencies, and many say that as far as South Africa goes, we actually we legislate for the rating agencies. We're more concerned about what they are going to say. And then there's your foreign direct investment that we're also trying to bring to the country. How do you actually come to some sort of conclusion that keeps everybody on side and fairly happy? Is that even possible?
Let's take it back, Sakina. First of all, we need to admit that we might have not made, we might have not made the progress we wanted to make, but we are certainly not where we were before. So you can't then completely say that the last 25 years has been a waste of time. There has been development, there has been a growth in the black middle class. We, as I'm sitting here, I'm one of the beneficiaries of that with those opportunities. So let's not throw a baby with bathwater, because the reality is that there has been progress. Now what we want is that it's the fast pace of that progress. And that progress must be mainly beneficiary to blacks, Africans in particular in our country. Many other minorities, Indians, have benefited in the democratic dispensation. Whites quadrupled their wealth in the democratic dispensation. The only shortfall here is that black people are still the ones that are lagging behind. Now what we need to devise and derive is what do we do to advance black people. Ongama is quite correct that in the business front is that you have DFIs, the whole entire DFIs that use a system that is almost similar to the banking criteria when it comes to credit that gets given to black businesses. And you go to many other countries in the world, you find companies that gets to fail 4 or 5 times and they are still backed. In fact, the top economy in the world, which is the US, most of the big companies there were backed one way or the other by government. And they were backed by angel investors, not once, not twice, but 4 times for them to succeed. Now, what we want with our government is that the framework of economic policy, particularly the BEE law, which we don't want to throw away, must lean towards advancing black business. It's very simple.
But haven't we heard that song over and over again? And what has it done for the majority of black South Africans who are still languishing in poverty? The unemployment statistics are, worse than they ever were, going up since yesterday again.
He calls that progress.
The reality
he says that we are in a good space, we are making progress. Let me tell you what he says when he talks about black people. He's talking about himself and the small black elites that have climbed into the ladder. Here is the reality of black people.
No, what I'm talking about...
Let me explain the reality.
Let him finish his point and then you can talk. And Ongama, you will wrap it up for us.
let me outline this, Sakina. We need to understand that labor is a particular interest group in our country. But it's not our country. There are many frameworks, and there's government, there's labor, there's business, and all of us, and civil society, and all of us needs to come into some form of consensus to work together to build this country. The reality is that, and it's not a lie, there's more than 2 million black middle class that came through the democratic system. then we can't ignore that. And I acknowledge, by the way, it's a painful experience to see our people still living in Alexander, to see our people still living in Squala. But I can tell you, the only hope to take those people out is not necessarily government. Government doesn't create jobs. The only hope is for us to double and triple the size of black businesses in our country so that our own cousins, our own families can be employed by us. This thing of the problem with the BE as it is now is that it created a political elite group that had alignment with politics to have equity stakes in white-owned businesses. There were no new value created
Just
there.
as it's heating up, I have to move on. We have less than a minute. Zwelinzima, very briefly, and I want Ongama to wrap it up for us.
The reality is that there are 10 million people who are unemployed in South Africa. And overwhelming majority of them are black people.
Black business can employ them.
That constitute around 38%. The reality is that where he comes from Tsolo. The unemployment rate have now hit 46.3%. He says that's progress. The reality is that between 55 to 63% of our people are trapped in degrading poverty. The overwhelming majority of them are black people.
I think the point is made there.
The reality is that we have become the most unequal society in the world, notwithstanding that 2 million black people are part of the middle strata. That's a reality of South Africa.
Which also needs to be interrogated. But Ongama, your final word on this?
Macroeconomic policy was resolved in 2003. Back then, the government started to have an expansionary fiscal policy. And that, by the way, Sakina, there's no fixed macroeconomic framework that works all the time. There are times when a nation is so exposed to debt, like we are now, that it needs to exercise discipline. Otherwise, it's going to be, it's going to sell its national sovereignty to lenders. And I don't think Mr. Vavi wants us to be, the slaves of a global financial capital. And we can be if our government continues to do expansionary fiscal policy willy-nilly. So there are times when you need an expansionary approach to fiscal policy. There are times when you must exercise absolute discipline. In terms of stimulating the economy in ways that grow it in a shared way for people in the periphery of the economy and those in the rural areas. It's not like we don't have what works, Sakina. We've done a study at Kucha where we found that if you grow local businesses, there's a greater chance that the multiplier effect goes even wider than when you target foreign direct investment. But in South Africa, we focus on one aspect of investment promotion and not the other. We need to grow local businesses in ways, and government has created space for that. There's policy, there's funding instruments. The issue is leading so that you have those outcomes. So from a macro point of view, as far as I'm concerned, there's minimal room the minimum latitude for government. At a micro level, where it's one community committing to be involved economically, then there's answers there. By the way, I've got a YouTube video on this, Sakina, that talks about self-reliance and the need for government that stimulates that so that we can grow our businesses.
I'll tell you what, we have to leave it there, but things were just starting to heat up there, and I'm going to try and see and speak to those who put this together, if we can bring them back, because there were quite a few issues that I wanted to touch on that we didn't get to. But thank you so much to Andile Nomlala from BMF, also Zwelinzima Vavi from SAFTU, and political analyst Ongama Mtimka, discussing the country's trajectory with the ANC at the helm of the 6th Democratic Administration. And as I say, I hope we'll be able to discuss it further. But for now, let's take a break.